Sometimes the animals we try to save end up saving us instead. Dr. Mark Ellison learned this truth the hard way when a stray barn cat walked into his clinic and changed everything he thought he knew about his quiet town. The cat had strange black wounds on her paws that weren't healing right. When Mark ran tests, he found something that made no sense. The wounds contained synthetic fibers and chemicals that shouldn't exist in nature. Then another cat showed up with the same mysterious injuries. Mark started asking questions around town and discovered something had been buried for decades. A government research facility on the edge of town had been shut down in the late 80s. Nobody wanted to talk about what happened there. Even his own brother, who used to work at the facility, told him to drop it. But more sick animals kept arriving at his clinic. The townspeople started pressuring him to stay quiet. What secrets were buried in those old labs that still reach out decades later? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk. The morning sun painted the rolling hills of Cedar Ridge in shades of gold and amber. The same gentle light that had greeted Dr. Mark Ellison for 30 years of early clinic rounds. At 54, Mark had settled into the comfortable rhythm of small-town veterinary medicine, a practice that revolved around seasonal cycles of birthing calves, vaccinating farm dogs, and treating the occasional injured barn cat. His weathered hands, steady despite decades of delicate work, had delivered countless foals and saved more animals than he'd ever bothered to count. Cedar Ridge was the kind of place where everyone knew your name and your business, where the local diner served the same meatloaf special every Wednesday, and where secrets were hard to keep, except, apparently, for the important ones. The town sat nestled in a valley surrounded by working farms and dense patches of pine forest, connected to the outside world by a two-lane highway that most people used for leaving rather than arriving. Mark's clinic occupied a converted farmhouse. On the town's main street, a white clapboard building with green shutters that had housed 3 generations of veterinarians before him. The front office still smelled faintly of pine disinfectant and the lavender air freshener his receptionist Betty insisted on plugging into every available outlet. Betty Kowalski had worked at the clinic for 15 years, long enough to know every pet owner in 3 counties and their preferred payment schedules. At 62, she possessed the kind of institutional memory that made small towns function. She remembered which farmers were late payers, which dogs bit, and which cats required 2 people and a thick blanket for examination. "Morning, Doc," Betty called from behind the reception desk as Mark pushed through the front door, coffee mug in one hand and his worn leather medical bag in the other. Her gray hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, and she wore the same floral print scrubs that had become her unofficial uniform. "Mrs. Henderson's bringing in that lame horse at 8:30, and we've got 3 vaccinations scheduled before lunch." Mark nodded, appreciating the predictability of it all. After 3 decades of practice, he'd found comfort in routine, the familiar weight of his stethoscope around his neck, the systematic way he organized his examination rooms, the careful notes he kept in his veterinary journal about every case, no matter how mundane. His record-keeping was meticulous, a habit drilled into him during his training and reinforced by years of experience. Every animal that passed through his doors received a detailed chart entry, complete with symptoms, treatments, and outcomes. The journal itself was a thick, leather-bound ledger he'd been maintaining since his first year of practice. Unlike the computer system Betty used for billing and appointments, Mark's journal contained his personal observations, the subtle signs that might matter later, the patterns that only became visible over time, the gut feelings that sometimes proved more valuable than test results. "Coffee's fresh," Betty added, gesturing toward the small kitchenette tucked behind the reception area. "And Sarah called to remind you about dinner with the Thompsons tonight." Sarah. Mark smiled at the mention of his wife's name. After 26 years of marriage, she still remembered social obligations he'd forget within minutes of agreeing to them. Sarah taught 4th grade at Cedar Ridge Elementary, where she'd become something of a local institution herself. Her students adored her, and she had a gift for making even the most restless 9-year-old sit still long enough to learn something. She understood Mark's dedication to his work, just as he appreciated her ability to shape young minds with patience and wisdom. The morning passed in its usual rhythm. Mark examined Mrs. Henderson's maw, a minor stone bruise that would heal with rest and proper shoeing administered, routine vaccinations to 3 farm dogs, and treated a cat with an infected scratch. Each case was entered carefully in his journal, part of the vast record of animal health he'd been compiling for decades. It was during his lunch break, while reviewing morning notes, that Mark first noticed something unusual. Betty had scheduled an appointment for a stray barn cat with infected paws, not uncommon in itself, but something about the brief description nagged at him. Perhaps it was the way the caller had hesitated when describing the wounds, or maybe just a veteran's intuition developed over years of practice. The afternoon brought its own set of routine cases, but Mark found his thoughts returning to that upcoming appointment. Cedar Ridge sat in the shadow of several large farms and an old government facility that had been shuttered since the late 80s. The facility had once been described as an agricultural research station, though Mark had never paid much attention to its operations. It squatted on several hundred acres of land about 3 miles outside town, surrounded by chain-link fencing that had grown rusty with age but remained intact. Most longtime residents remembered when the facility employed nearly 100 people, back when the parking lot filled with cars each morning and trucks made regular deliveries. Then, almost overnight in 1988, it had closed. The official explanation involved budget cuts and relocated operations, but Mark recalled whispered conversations about the shutdown being more sudden than planned. Workers were given severance packages and told not to discuss their employment, which struck many as odd for what was supposed to be agricultural research. Mark's own brother Tom had worked there briefly as a security contractor in the mid-80s, though he'd never said much about the job. Tom had left Cedar Ridge shortly after the facility closed, eventually settling in Denver, where he worked in corporate security. They spoke perhaps 3 times a year, usually at holidays, and Tom never showed much interest in visiting there. Hometown. As the afternoon wore on, Mark found himself thinking about the abandoned facility more than he had in years. The property remained federally owned, according to county records, though no one seemed to know what, if anything, happened there now. The buildings were still visible from the highway, gray concrete structures that seemed to grow more imposing with each passing year of neglect. Betty interrupted his musings with a gentle knock on his office door. "Doc, your 4 o'clock is here with that barn cat." Mark looked up from his journal, realizing he'd been staring at the same page for 10 minutes without reading a word. "Send them in, Betty." The farmer who entered was Jake Morrison, a weathered man in his 60s who ran cattle on 300 acres north of town. Mark had known Jake for 20 years, had delivered dozens of calves on his property, and treated everything from sick horses to injured farm dogs. Jake was not the type to worry unnecessarily about animals' farm life, required a certain pragmatic approach to animal welfare, which made his obvious concern about this barn cat all the more noteworthy. "Thanks for seeing us, Doc," Jake said, carrying a small animal carrier with careful deliberation. "This little gal showed up at the barn about a week ago. Thought she just had some cuts on her feet, but they're not healing right. Getting worse, actually." Mark opened the carrier and gently lifted out a small tortoiseshell cat, perhaps 2 years old, who offered no resistance to being handled. That, in itself, was unusual. Most feral barn cats required thick gloves and careful restraint. This one seemed almost grateful for human contact, purring weakly despite obvious discomfort. "Let's take a look," Mark said, carrying the cat to his examination table. The moment he saw the animal's paws, he understood Jake's concern. The wounds were unlike anything in his 3 decades of practice. Each front paw showed areas of blackened tissue that looked neither like infection nor injury. The lesions had distinct borders, as if the healthy tissue simply stopped and something else began. They weren't bleeding, but they weren't healing either. The affected areas felt different to the touch, firmer than normal tissue, with an almost synthetic quality that made Mark's professional instincts sound quite alarms. "How long did you say she's been like this?" Mark asked, examining each paw with a magnifying glass. "Started noticing it about 5 days ago," Jake replied. "Figured? It might be from walking on something sharp, but look at those edges. Never seen anything quite like it." Mark had to agree. In 30 years of veterinary medicine, he treated countless paw injuries, cuts from glass, infections from thorns, chemical burns from cleaning products. This was something entirely different. The blackened tissue showed no signs of the inflammation you'd expect from infection, no indication of the tissue death associated with severe burns or frostbite. "I'm going to need to run some tests," Mark said, his voice betraying none of the unease he felt. "Take some tissue samples, maybe send them to the regional lab for analysis." Jake nodded, trust evident in his weathered features. "Whatever you think is best, Doc. She's a good mouser, and it seems cruel to let her suffer if there's something we can do." Mark prepared a mild sedative and carefully collected small samples from the affected tissue, noting how the material seemed to resist his scalpel in an unusual way. The samples were unlike anything he'd seen, not quite organic, but not entirely synthetic either. He placed them in sterile containers, already planning the tests he'd request from the regional veterinary laboratory. As Jake prepared to leave with the sedated cat, Mark found himself asking questions he'd never needed to ask before. "Jake, has she been anywhere unusual? Any new areas on your property? Changes in routine?" Jake paused at the door, considering. "Well, she tends to wander pretty far for a barn cat. Probably covers most of the north pasture. Maybe even gets close to that old government place." No, the research station that shut down back in the 80s. Mark felt something cold settle in his stomach. "The research facility? Yeah, she's been spotted near that fence line a few times. Why? You think that might have something to do with this?" "Probably not," Mark replied, though he was already making mental notes. Just trying to understand her environment. "I'll call you when the test results come back." After Jake left, Mark sat in his office staring at the tissue samples. 3 decades of veterinary practice had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct he possessed was telling him that whatever was wrong with this barn cat, it wasn't natural. The wounds defied every category of injury or disease he'd studied, and their proximity to the old research facility struck him as more than coincidental. He opened his veterinary journal and began a detailed entry about the case, sketching unusual wound patterns and documenting every observation he'd made. As he wrote, Mark found himself thinking about the facility again, wondering what kind of agricultural research had required such security, such secrecy, and such an abrupt shutdown. Outside his office window, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street, the same peaceful scene that had greeted him every day for 30 years. But something had changed. The comfortable predictability of his small-town practice had been disrupted by a barn cat with impossible wounds. And Mark Ellison, methodical, careful, thorough Mark Ellison, was about to discover that some questions, once asked, demand answers regardless of the cost. 3 days passed before the test results arrived, and Mark found himself checking his phone every few minutes, despite knowing the lab would call when they had answers. The barn cat, whom Betty had started calling Patches, remained at the clinic, under observation. Her condition hadn't worsened, but it hadn't improved either. The blackened areas on her paws maintained their strange, static appearance, neither spreading nor healing. Mark had called the regional veterinary laboratory twice to confirm they'd received the samples, and both times the technician assured him the tests were being processed. What the technician didn't mention was the unusual request from their supervisor to flag any results that seemed anomalous or requiring additional analysis. When Dr. Patricia Chun from the lab finally called, her voice carried a tension Mark had never heard from her before. They'd worked together on dozens of cases over the years, and Patricia was known for her straightforward, clinical approach to diagnostic work. "Mark, I need you to sit down for this," she said without preamble. "Your tissue samples, we've run them through every test in our protocol, and then some." Mark felt his pulse quicken. "What did you find?" "That's the problem. We found things that shouldn't be there. The tissue contains synthetic polymer fibers, not just embedded in it, but integrated at the cellular level. We're also seeing trace elements that don't occur naturally in biological systems. Specifically, we detected compounds that appeared to be engineered synthetic proteins." The words didn't compute immediately. Mark found himself asking Patricia to repeat what she'd said, hoping he'd misunderstood. "I'm saying the tissue isn't entirely organic anymore," Patricia continued. "It's as if someone took normal cat paw tissue and somehow incorporated synthetic materials into its structure. The synthetic components aren't foreign objects that got lodged in wounds. They're integrated into the tissue itself." Mark stared out his office window at the peaceful street scene, trying to process information that challenged everything he thought he knew about biology. Is that even possible? "Not with any technology I'm aware of. We've consulted with our colleagues at the University Medical Center, and they're baffled. They want to know where this sample came from." Before Mark could respond, Meddy knocked on his door with an expression that immediately told him something was wrong. She held the phone with one hand pressed over the mouthpiece. "Doc, I hate to interrupt, but we have another emergency. Charlie Watson just called about his barn cat. Says she's got the same kind of wounds on her paws." Mark felt the world shift slightly off its axis. "Tell him I'll see the cat immediately." He turned back to his phone conversation with Patricia. "I have to go. We may have another case." "Mark, wait. Before you hang up, I need to ask you not to discuss these results with anyone else until we understand what we're dealing with. We're talking about biological anomalies that can have serious implications." "What kind of implications?" "The kind that might involve federal agencies if this represents some form of biological contamination or experimental accident." Charlie Watson arrived within the hour, carrying a gray tabby cat that displayed identical symptoms to Jake Morrison's barn cat. The wounds were in precisely the same locations on both front paws, with the same distinct borders and synthetic appearance. Charlie, a quiet man who farmed corn and soybeans on the eastern edge of town, was visibly shaken. "Never seen anything like it, Doc," Charlie said as Mark examined the second cat. "Healthy as could be one day, then these black patches just appeared. They're not infected, don't seem to hurt her much, but they're not going away either." Mark performed the same careful examination he'd done 3 days earlier, documenting every detail in his journal. The similarities between the two cases were impossible to ignore. Same species, same age range, same unusual wound patterns in identical locations. "Charlie, I have to ask, does your cat roam near the old research facility?" Charlie's expression grew thoughtful. "Matter of fact, yes. She's been spotted near that fence line several times. My property runs pretty close to the southern boundary of that place. Why? Just trying to understand what these cats might have encountered. I'm going to need to run the same tests I did on the other cat." As Mark collected tissue samples from the second cat, he found himself working with unusual care, as if the samples might be more dangerous than they appeared. Patricia's words about federal agencies echoed in his mind, along with her warning about biological contamination. After Charlie left, Mark sat in his office staring at the two sets of samples. Two cats, two different farms, identical symptoms, both with access to the area near the old research facility. The pattern was too clear to ignore, but its implications were deeply unsettling. He opened his veterinary journal and began documenting the second case, placing it directly after his notes on patches. As he wrote, connections began forming in his mind. The research facility had supposedly been involved in agricultural research, but what kind of agricultural work would require such security? What kind of research would leave contamination that could still affect animals decades later? Mark made a decision that would change everything. He reached for his phone and dialed information, asking for the number of the Cedar Ridge Public Library. If the facility had been involved in legitimate research, there would be records, newspaper, articles, public documents, maybe even environmental impact studies. Cedar Ridge Library, this is Dorothy. Dorothy, this is Mark Ellison. I was wondering if you might be able to help me research some local history. Dorothy Brennan had been the town librarian for 35 years, and her memory of local events was encyclopedic. Of course, Dr. Ellison. What are you looking for? Information about the old research facility. Newspaper articles, public records, anything from the time it was operating and when it shut down. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Dorothy spoke again, her voice carried a note of caution. That's the second time this week someone's asked about that place. May I ask why you're interested? Mark felt another chill. Someone else has been asking? A gentleman came in 2 days ago, wanted to see any public records related to the facility. Said he was doing research for a book about local history. Seemed nice enough, but he took quite a few notes. Did he leave a name? He signed in as J. Smith, but it seemed like he didn't want to be remembered, if you know what I mean. Mark thanked Dorothy and arranged to visit the library the following morning, but her words stayed with him. Someone else was interested in the facility, someone who didn't want to be identified. The timing struck him as more than coincidental. That evening, over dinner with Sarah, Mark found himself struggling to concentrate on normal conversation. Sarah was describing her day at school, telling him about a student's breakthrough with long division, but his mind kept returning to synthetic tissue and mysterious researchers asking about abandoned facilities. You're not listening to me, Sarah said gently, reaching across the table to touch his hand. What's wrong? Mark looked into his wife's concerned brown eyes and realized he was facing his first real dilemma. Patricia had warned him not to discuss the test results with anyone, but Sarah deserved to know when something was troubling him. They'd shared everything for 26 years, his worries about difficult cases, her frustrations with challenging students, the small victories and defeats that made up their quiet life together. I had some unusual test results today, he said carefully. A couple of barn cats with injuries I can't explain. Sarah studied his face with the perception that came from decades of marriage. Unusual how? The tissue samples contained synthetic materials integrated at the cellular level. The lab says it shouldn't be possible with current technology. That does sound strange. What do you think caused it? Mark hesitated, then decided to share his suspicions. Both cats have been spotted near the old research facility. I'm starting to wonder if there's some connection. Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. She'd lived in Cedar Ridge as long as Mark had, remembered the facility's abrupt closure and the rumors that had circulated afterward. Are you going to investigate? I think I have to. If there's contamination that's still affecting animals, people need to know. Be careful, Sarah said, squeezing his hand. Sometimes when places shut down suddenly like that, there are reasons beyond budget cuts. That night, Mark lay awake thinking about Patricia's warning, Dorothy's mysterious researcher, and Sarah's cautious advice. 2 cats with impossible injuries, both connected to a facility that had been closed for over 30 years. Tomorrow he would begin looking for answers, though he was beginning to suspect that some people didn't want those answers found. In his veterinary journal, he'd written detailed notes about both cases, documenting everything from the unusual tissue consistency to the cat's ranging patterns. The journal had become more than a medical record. It was becoming evidence of something that shouldn't exist. Proof of questions that demanded answers regardless of who might prefer they remain unasked. As Mark finally drifted towards sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that examining those 2 barn cats had set something in motion, something that would prove far more significant than he could imagine. Sometimes the simplest cases, a stray cat with mysterious wounds, become the threads that, when pulled, unravel secrets that were meant to stay buried. The Cedar Ridge Public Library occupied a converted Victorian mansion on Elm Street, its tall windows and wraparound porch giving it the appearance of a grand home rather than a repository of local knowledge. Dorothy Bren had transformed the building's former parlors and dining rooms into reading areas and research spaces, creating an atmosphere that encouraged quiet investigation and thoughtful discovery. Mark arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, finding Dorothy already at work behind the circulation desk. At 70, she maintained the precise movements and sharp attention to detail that had made her an institution in the community. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore the same style of cardigan sweater that had become her trademark over 3 decades of library service. "Dr. Ellison, right on time," she said, gesturing toward a table where she'd already assembled several boxes of materials. "I pulled everything we have on the research facility, newspaper clippings, county commission minutes, even some old aerial photographs from the Historical Society." Mark thanked her and settled at the research table, opening the first box with the anticipation of a detective examining evidence. The earliest materials dated back to 1976, when the federal government first announced plans to establish what they called the Cedar Ridge Agricultural Research Station. The initial newspaper articles painted the facility as a boon for the local economy. Headlines proclaimed Federal Research Center to bring 200 jobs to Cedar Ridge and agricultural innovation coming to rural community. The articles described research into crop enhancement, soil improvement, and livestock health projects. That seemed perfectly suited for a farming community. But as Mark worked through the chronological collection, he began noticing subtle changes in the reporting. By 1980, articles about the facility became less frequent and more vague. References to classified agricultural research and restricted access protocols appeared with increasing regularity. The facility that had once welcomed community tours and local newspaper coverage had become decidedly less open about its activities. The most revealing documents were the county commission minutes from the mid-1980s. Mark found several entries, recording complaints from local residents about unusual truck traffic, strange odors, and lights burning all night at the facility. One particularly detailed complaint came from a farmer whose property bordered the research station. Trucks coming and going at all hours. The farmer had told the commission, "Heavy trucks, not the kind you'd expect for agricultural research. And the smell sometimes when the wind's right. You get this chemical odor that makes your eyes water." The commission's response was always the same. They would contact federal authorities and report back. But no follow-up reports appeared in subsequent meeting minutes, suggesting that either no information was received or no information was shared. Mark found himself taking detailed notes, creating his own timeline of the facility's operations. What emerged was a picture of a research station that had gradually become more secretive and more isolated from the community it was supposed to serve. The transformation from open agricultural research to classified operations had occurred over several years, but the change was unmistakable. The facility's closure in 1988 generated surprisingly little newspaper coverage. A brief article in the Cedar Ridge Weekly reported that budget cuts and operational restructuring had led to the research station's shutdown. But the article contained no quotes from facility administrators and no details about what would happen to the property. More interesting was what Mark found in the archived aerial photographs. The Historical Society had commissioned regular aerial surveys of the county, and the photos showed the facility's evolution over time. The 1977 photographs showed a modest complex of perhaps 6 buildings surrounded by experimental agricultural plots. By 1985, the facility had expanded to include more than a dozen structures, including what appeared to be underground facilities marked by ventilation shafts and service entries. But it was the 1989 photograph taken a year after the supposed closure that caught Mark's attention. While the main buildings appeared empty, several of the smaller structures showed signs of continued activity. Vehicles were parked near what looked like maintenance entrances, and one of the ventilation systems showed the heat signature consistent with active operations. "Find anything interesting?" Dorothy asked, appearing at his elbow with a cup of coffee. Mark looked up from the photographs, realizing he'd been studying them for over an hour. "More than I expected. This place was much larger than I remembered, and it might not have been as completely shut down as people thought." Dorothy glanced around the empty library, then pulled up a chair beside him. "I've been the librarian here for 35 years, Dr. Ellison, and I've learned that some stories are worth remembering, even when people would rather forget them." "What do you mean?" "The gentleman who came in asking about the facility, Mr. Smith. He wasn't researching local history. He was looking for specific information about soil contamination reports and environmental monitoring data. He seemed particularly interested in anything related to groundwater studies." Mark felt his pulse quicken. Did he find what he was looking for? That's just it. There weren't any public environmental reports. For a facility that operated for over a decade, there should have been environmental impact studies, soil monitoring data, water quality reports. But all we have are the basic operational documents and newspaper clippings. What happened to the environmental records? Dorothy's expression grew thoughtful. "I've wondered about that myself. Most government facilities, especially research operations, generate extensive environmental documentation. The absence of such records is almost as interesting as their presence would be." Mark spent another hour reviewing the materials, paying particular attention to any references to environmental concerns. What he found was a pattern of questions without answers, complaints about strange odors and unusual truck traffic that were never resolved, environmental concerns that were referred to authorities who never responded, and a research facility that seemed to operate with unusual independence from normal oversight. As he prepared to leave, Dorothy handed him a manila folder. "Photocopies of the most relevant documents. I thought you might want to review them more carefully. Thank you. This has been incredibly helpful." "Dr. Ellison, may I ask what prompted your interest in the facility?" Mark considered how much to share, then decided Dorothy deserved honesty. "I've been treating some animals with unusual injuries. Both cats had been spotted near the facility property, and the injuries are unlike anything I've seen in 30 years of practice." Dorothy nodded slowly, as if his answer confirmed suspicions she'd been harboring. "Be careful with your investigation. The fact that someone else is asking questions suggests you're not the only one who thinks that place might still be affecting the community." Mark left the library with more questions than answers, but also with a growing conviction that the research facility's closure had been less complete than the community believed. The expanded infrastructure shown in the aerial photos, the absence of environmental documentation, and the mysterious Mr. Smith all pointed towards secrets that someone wanted to keep buried. Driving back to his clinic, Mark found himself paying attention to the landscape in a new way. The facility sat about 3 miles northeast of town, positioned where several farm properties converged. If there had been environmental contamination, it could potentially affect a much larger area than just the facility grounds at the clinic. Betty greeted him with news that made his discoveries even more concerning. "Doc, Jake Morrison called about that barn cat patches. He says 2 more cats on his property are showing the same symptoms." Mark felt something cold settle in his stomach. What had started as an unusual case involving 2 animals was potentially expanding into something much larger. If contamination from the facility was affecting multiple animals across different properties, the scope of the problem could be far beyond what he'd imagined. He spent the rest of the morning reviewing the library, documents, and updating his veterinary journal with the new information. The picture emerging was troubling. A research facility that had operated with unusual secrecy, closed under mysterious circumstances, and might still be affecting the local environment decades later. That evening, Mark spread the photocopied documents across his home office desk, creating a timeline of events and mapping the facility's expansion over its years of operation. Sarah joined him, reading over his shoulder and asking thoughtful questions about the implications of what he'd discovered. "So the facility was much larger than anyone realized, and there's evidence it might not have been completely shut down?" she asked. "That's what it looks like. And now I have at least 4 cats showing symptoms that shouldn't be medically possible." Sarah studied the aerial photographs with the careful attention she brought to her teaching. "Mark, look at this. The facility was positioned right where several watersheds converge. If there was contamination, it could affect water sources across a much wider area." Mark followed her pointing finger and realized she was right. The facility's location was ideal for agricultural research, but it was also positioned where contamination could potentially spread through natural water flow to affect multiple farm properties. "Tomorrow I'm going to visit the facility," Mark decided. "Even if it's abandoned, I might be able to learn something about what kind of research was conducted." "There, please be careful," Sarah said, touching his arm. "If that place is still affecting animals after 30 years, there might be dangers we don't understand." Mark promised to be cautious, but he was already planning his reconnaissance mission. The facility blueprints Dorothy had provided showed the layout of the main buildings, and the aerial photographs revealed access roads that might still be passable. Whatever secrets were buried at the Cedar Ridge Agricultural Research Station, Mark was determined to uncover them for the sake of the affected animals and the community that might still be at risk. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call that changed Mark's plans entirely. He was reviewing the facility blueprints over breakfast when his phone rang, displaying a number he hadn't seen in months. His brother Tom calling from Denver. "Tom?" Mark answered, surprised to hear from his brother outside of their usual holiday check-ins. "Mark, we need to talk." Tom's voice carried attention and immediately put Mark on alert. "I heard you've been asking questions about the old research facility." Mark felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "How did you hear that?" "Word travels fast in a small town, and some words travel faster than others. Listen, I'm driving down today. Don't do anything regarding that facility until I get there." "Tom, what's going on? You worked there, didn't you?" "Maybe you can help me understand." "Not over the phone," Tom interrupted. "And Mark, be very careful who you talk to about this. I'll be there by afternoon." The line went dead, leaving Mark staring at his phone and wondering how his brother had learned about his investigation so quickly. Dorothy's warning about Mr. Smith asking questions took on new significance, as did Patricia's caution about federal agencies. Instead of visiting the facility as planned, Mark spent the morning at his clinic treating routine cases while his mind raced with questions about his brother's sudden involvement. Betty noticed his distraction during the examination of a farmer's sick calf. "Doc, you seem a million miles away today," she observed as they finished vaccinating the animal. "Sorry, Betty. Just thinking about those cats with the unusual wounds." Betty's expression grew thoughtful. "You know, I've been meaning to mention something. My late husband Joe used to do some contracting work out at that research place in the 80s. He never talked much about it. Said he'd signed some kind of agreement, but he did mention that the security was unusually tight for agricultural research." Mark looked up from his notes. "What kind of security?" "Armed guards, multiple checkpoints, background checks for anyone who worked there." Joe used to joke that it was easier to get into the bank vault than onto that research site. He also said the workers seemed, I don't know how to put this, nervous. Like they weren't entirely comfortable with what they were doing. Did Joe ever mention what kind of research was actually conducted there? Betty shook her head. He honored his agreement and never discussed details. But I remember he came home one day in 1987 looking troubled. Said his contract wouldn't be renewed and that he was glad to be done with the place. A year later, the whole facility shut down. Mark made mental notes of everything Betty shared, adding her husband's experience to his growing file of evidence that the research facility had been far more complex and secretive than publicly acknowledged. The pattern of non-disclosure agreements and nervous workers painted a picture of operations that went well beyond normal agricultural research. Tom arrived at the clinic just after lunch, driving a black pickup truck that looked more like a government vehicle than personal transportation. At 51, Tom Ellison had maintained the alert bearing and careful movements of someone who'd spent his career in security work. His gray hair was cut short, and his clothing dark jeans, plain shirt. Conservative jacket seemed chosen to avoid drawing attention. "We need to talk privately," Tom said after greeting Betty with polite reservation. Mark led his brother to his office and closed the door, noting how Tom automatically positioned himself where he could see both the door and the window. "Okay. Tom, what's this about?" Tom sat heavily in the chair across from Mark's desk, looking older than his 51 years. "You've been asking questions about the Cedar Ridge facility, and those questions have attracted attention from people who don't want them asked." "What kind of attention?" "The kind that involves federal agencies and classified operations that supposedly ended 30 years ago. Tom rubbed his forehead as if fighting a headache. "Mark, I need you to understand something. I never wanted to be involved in any of this again, but your investigation has put us both in a difficult position." Mark felt anger building in his chest. "Tom, I'm treating animals with injuries that shouldn't be medically possible. Both cats have been near that facility. If there's contamination that's still affecting wildlife, people need to know. It's not that simple," Tom said quietly. "The research conducted at that facility, it wasn't agricultural research. It was biological weapons development, conducted under military contracts with civilian cover." The words hit Mark like physical blows. "Biological weapons?" Tom nodded grimly. "I was security chief for the final 2 years of operations. Project Nightshade, they called it. Development of synthetic biological agents that could be deployed for strategic purposes. The agricultural cover story was just that, a cover story." Mark stared at his brother, trying to process the implications. "Biological weapons in Cedar Ridge. The location was chosen specifically because it was remote, surrounded by agricultural land that provided natural camouflage and far from major population centers. If something went wrong, something did go wrong," Mark interrupted. "That's why it shut down so suddenly." Tom's expression confirmed Mark's suspicion. In early 1988, there was a containment breach. Not a major one, but enough to compromise some of the research materials. The decision was made to evacuate the facility and seal the contaminated areas. "Seal them? You mean the contamination is still there?" "Mark, you have to understand, this wasn't like a chemical spill that could be cleaned up. Some of the synthetic Biological agents they were developing were designed to be persistent, to survive in environmental conditions for extended periods. When the breach occurred, the safest option was containment rather than attempted cleanup. Mark felt his world shifting again. So the facility was never really shut down. The research operations were terminated, but monitoring continued. There's a skeleton crew that maintains surveillance equipment and conducts periodic environmental assessments. The contaminated areas remain sealed, but Tom paused, choosing his words carefully. But containment systems can degrade over time. And now animals are showing symptoms of exposure to synthetic biological materials. Tom looked directly at his brother, which is why your investigation has attracted so much attention. If the containment has been compromised, if materials from Project Nightshade are affecting local wildlife, it represents a potential catastrophe that could affect far more than a few barn cats. Mark opened his veterinary journal and showed Tom his detailed notes about the affected animals. 4 cats so far, all showing identical symptoms: tissue integration with synthetic materials that shouldn't be possible with current technology. Tom studied the notes with the careful attention of someone trained to assess threat levels. This is worse than I feared. The synthetic integration you're describing, that was one of the theoretical outcomes they were trying to achieve with Project Nightshade. They wanted to create agents that could modify biological systems at the cellular level. Tom, if this contamination is spreading, if it's affecting animals across multiple farm properties, then we have a situation that goes far beyond veterinary medicine. Tom finished. Mark, I need you to stop your investigation immediately. The people monitoring this situation will do whatever it takes to maintain containment and secrecy. I can't stop, Mark said firmly. I'm a veterinarian. These animals need help, and if there's a broader threat to the community is considered expendable, Tom said bluntly. Cedar Ridge has always been considered expendable. That's why they built the facility here in the first place. The brothers sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of Tom's revelations settling between them. Mark thought about his 30 years in this community, his patients, his neighbors, Sarah's students, all of them potentially at risk from contamination that had been hidden for decades. What about the man who was asking questions at the library? Mark asked. The one who called himself Smith? Tom's expression darkened. Federal agent, almost certainly. The fact that he was looking for environmental data suggests they're concerned about containment failure. Your investigation probably triggered a review of the situation. Tom, I need to ask you something directly. Are you still involved with this? Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring out the office window at the peaceful street scene. I received a call 3 days ago. A consulting contract, they called it. Temporary assignment to assess information security risks related to the Cedar Ridge situation. I told them I wasn't interested, but they insisted. They made it clear that my cooperation was expected, not requested. My knowledge of the original operations makes me valuable for damage assessment. Mark felt a surge of protectiveness toward his brother. Tom, you don't have to do this. You can stay here. Help me figure out how to protect the community. Mark, you don't understand. The forces we're dealing with. Project Nightshade involved multiple federal agencies and defense contractors. The amount of money invested, the classified technology developed. There are people who will go to any length to keep this secret, even if it means letting contamination spread, even if it means people get sick. Tom's answer chilled Mark to the bone. Especially then. If the contamination spreads beyond containment, if civilians are affected, the liability and security implications become catastrophic. It would be easier to relocate the entire community and classify the area as permanently restricted. Mark thought about Sarah, about Betty, about all the families who'd built their lives in Cedar Ridge. They would evacuate the whole town? They would do whatever damage control required. And Mark, they've been monitoring your investigation from the beginning. Your phone calls to the lab, your visit to the library, probably this conversation. They know you're not going to stop asking questions. The implications were staggering. Mark realized that his simple desire to help some injured animals had put him at the center of a decades-old conspiracy that involved national security agencies and military contractors. Worse, his continued investigation might trigger actions that could destroy the community he'd spent his life serving. What do you think I should do? Mark asked his brother. Tom was quiet for a long time before answering. Officially, I have to advise you to cease your investigation and turn over all materials to appropriate authorities. Unofficially, as your brother, I think you're the only person in a position to find out how bad this situation really is. You're asking me to choose between my safety and my responsibility to this community. I'm telling you that choice has already been made for you. The question is whether you're going to fight back or let them control the narrative. Mark looked at his veterinary journal, filled with careful observations about animals that shouldn't medically exist, symptoms that defied explanation, contamination that reached across decades to affect innocent creatures who'd wandered too close to buried secrets. I need more information, Mark decided. I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with before I can decide how to protect people. Tom nodded, though his expression remained troubled. Then, we need to be very careful about how we proceed. They're watching you, and they're watching me. Any investigation from this point forward has to assume we're under surveillance. Can you help me? I can share what I know about the original Project Nightshade operations, and I can try to find out what the current monitoring situation looks like. But Mark, if we do this, there's no going back. Once we start pulling threads, we have to be prepared for what might unravel. Mark thought about the 4 cats in his clinic, about Jake Morrison and Charlie Watson trusting him to help their animals, about a community that had no idea they might be living with contamination that could affect them for generations. The threads are already being pulled, Mark said. The question is whether we're going to help guide what comes next, or let someone else decide the fate of everyone we care about. That evening, Mark and Tom developed a plan that balanced caution with necessity. They would investigate the contamination systematically, but they would also assume that every action was being monitored. Tom's security background proved invaluable in planning an approach that might avoid immediate detection. We need independent verification of the contamination, Tom explained as they sat in Mark's home office, speaking in low voices despite the closed doors. Your veterinary lab results are compelling, but we need environmental data that can't be dismissed or suppressed. Mark had been thinking along similar lines. I know someone who might help Dr. Elena Vasquez at the State University. She specializes in environmental contamination and has the equipment to conduct sophisticated soil and water analysis. Can you trust her? I've known Elena for 15 years through veterinary conferences. She's completely trustworthy, and her laboratory is independent of federal oversight. Tom considered this. Contact her, but don't discuss details over the phone. Arrange to meet in person, somewhere away from both your clinic and her university. The next morning, Mark called Elena's office and arranged to meet for lunch at a restaurant halfway between Cedar Ridge and the university, ostensibly to discuss a research collaboration. Elena Vasquez was in her early 40s, a respected environmental scientist who'd built her reputation studying industrial contamination and its effects on ecological systems. They met at a small cafe in Millerville, a farming community where 2 strangers having lunch would attract no particular attention. Elena arrived precisely on time, her dark hair pulled back and her manner radiating the focused energy that had made her successful in a demanding field. Mark, it's good to see you, she said as they settled into a corner booth. Your call intrigued In me, you mentioned environmental contamination affecting livestock? Mark had prepared his approach carefully. I'm treating animals with symptoms. I can't explain tissue changes that appear to involve synthetic materials integrated at the cellular level. The affected animals have all been exposed to areas near an old government research facility. Elena's expression shifted from polite interest to professional focus. Synthetic materials integrated into biological tissue? That's not something you see in typical environmental contamination. I was hoping you might be willing to conduct some independent environmental testing. Soil and water samples from the area around the facility. What kind of facility was this? Mark chose his words carefully. Officially, it was described as agricultural research. But there are indications it may have involved more specialized work that was shut down abruptly in 1988. Elena studied Mark's face with the careful attention of a scientist evaluating data. Mark, are you suggesting this facility was involved in activities that could have left long-term environmental contamination? I'm suggesting that something is affecting local wildlife in ways that shouldn't be medically possible, and I need independent scientific analysis to understand what we're dealing with. Elena was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the implications of what Mark was asking. Finally, she leaned forward and spoke in a lower voice. I can conduct the environmental analysis you're requesting, but I need to understand the potential risks. If this facility was involved in classified research, if there are contamination issues that government agencies want to keep quiet, there could be risks, Mark admitted. But Elena, if contamination is spreading and affecting wildlife, it might eventually affect human populations. Don't we have a responsibility to find out? Elena nodded slowly. Yes, we do. But we also need to be smart about how we proceed. I'll need to collect samples without drawing official attention. And I'll need to conduct the analysis using equipment that isn't connected to any federal monitoring systems. They spent the next hour planning a systematic approach to environmental testing. Elena would focus on soil and water samples collected from multiple locations around the facility, looking specifically for synthetic biological compounds and persistent organic pollutants that might indicate experimental contamination. I'll need exact coordinates for the sample sites, Elena said, as they prepared to leave. And Mark, if my analysis confirms contamination, we'll need to decide very carefully how to proceed with that information. That afternoon, Mark returned to his clinic to find an unexpected visitor waiting in the parking lot. A man in his 50s, wearing a conservative suit, stood beside a government sedan, his bearing and demeanor immediately identifying him as federal law enforcement. Dr. Ellison? The man approached as Mark got out of his truck. I'm Agent David Reynolds, Environmental Protection Agency. I was hoping we could have a brief conversation about some recent veterinary cases you've been handling. Mark felt his pulse quicken, but kept his expression neutral. Of course. Would you like to come inside? Actually, I was hoping we could take a drive. Sometimes, these conversations are better conducted away from your workplace. Every instinct Mark possessed told him not to get into a car with Agent Reynolds, but he also recognized that refusing might create more problems than compliance. All right, let me just let my receptionist know I'll be away from the clinic. Betty looked up as Mark entered, immediately noticing his tension. Everything okay, Doc? I'll be away for about an hour, Mark said, hoping his voice sounded normal. If any emergencies come in, refer them to Dr. Patterson in Millerville. Agent Reynolds drove them to a scenic overlook about 5 miles outside town, a spot where they could talk without being overheard. The agent's manner was professional, but carried an undertone of authority that made it clear this was not a casual conversation. Dr. Ellison, we understand you've been treating some animals with unusual symptoms, Reynolds began once they'd parked. We're conducting a routine environmental assessment and would appreciate your cooperation. What kind of environmental assessment? The kind that involves potential contamination from former government facilities. Your veterinary records could be helpful in determining whether there are ongoing environmental issues that need to be addressed. Mark chose his words carefully. I've treated several cats with unusual tissue abnormalities. The symptoms are unlike anything in my previous experience. We'd like to review your case files and test results. We'd also appreciate your cooperation in not discussing these cases with outside parties while our assessment is ongoing. The request was phrased politely, but Mark understood it was not really a request. What kind of outside parties? Environmental researchers, journalists, other veterinarians who might misinterpret the significance of isolated cases. Sometimes unusual symptoms can be misunderstood as evidence of environmental problems when they're actually just medical anomalies. And if I determine that these aren't medical anomalies, if the symptoms indicate genuine environmental contamination? Agent Reynolds turned to look directly at Mark. Dr. Ellison, I need you to understand that some environmental situations involve national security considerations. In such cases, information needs to be carefully managed to prevent public panic and ensure that appropriate remediation can be conducted safely. What you're really saying is that if I find evidence of contamination, you want me to keep quiet about it. I'm saying that if you find evidence of contamination, we want you to work with appropriate federal agencies to ensure the situation is handled properly. Independent actions by well-meaning individuals can sometimes make environmental problems worse rather than better. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Agent Reynolds making it clear that Mark's cooperation was expected and that continued investigation outside official channels would be viewed as interfering with federal environmental assessment procedures. When they returned to the clinic, Reynolds handed Mark a business card. Please contact me before you discuss these cases with anyone else. We want to make sure that accurate information is shared and that any necessary environmental protection measures are implemented correctly. After the agent left, Mark sat in his office trying to process what had just occurred. The federal government was clearly aware of the contamination, clearly concerned about information control, and clearly prepared to use official authority to manage the situation according to their priorities rather than community safety. He called Tom from his office phone, speaking carefully in case the line was monitored. Tom, I just had an interesting conversation with a federal agent about my veterinary cases. I think we need to accelerate our timeline for environmental testing. Understood, Tom replied. I'll be in touch soon with some additional information. That might be helpful. That evening, Mark updated his veterinary journal with detailed notes about his conversation with Agent Reynolds, documenting the federal government's clear interest in controlling information about the contamination. The journal was becoming more than a medical record. It was becoming a chronicle of a cover-up that had been maintained for over 30 years. As he wrote, Mark realized that his investigation had reached a critical juncture. The federal government was now actively involved in managing the situation, which meant that any further investigation would have to be conducted with extreme caution. But the conversation with Agent Reynolds had also confirmed something important. The contamination was real. It was ongoing, and authorities were more concerned with secrecy than with public safety. Elena would begin her environmental testing within the next few days, providing independent scientific data that couldn't be suppressed or manipulated by federal agencies. But Mark also knew that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Soon, official pressure would make continued investigation impossible, and the truth about Cedar Ridge's contamination would remain buried for another generation. Elena began her covert environmental testing 3 days later, collecting soil and water samples from strategic locations around the old research facility during early morning hours when her presence would be less likely to attract attention. She worked systematically, documenting GPS coordinates for each sample site and maintaining careful chain of custody protocols Despite the unofficial nature of her investigation, Mark met her at a truck stop diner 20 miles from Cedar Ridge to receive her preliminary findings, both of them understanding that their collaboration now carried significant risks. Elena arrived carrying a laptop and a manila folder thick with printed analysis results. "Mark, you were right to be concerned," she said without preamble, opening her laptop to display a series of colorful charts and graphs. "I found synthetic, biological compounds in soil samples collected from 6 different locations around the facility perimeter." Mark studied the data, trying to understand its implications. "What kind of synthetic compounds?" "Engineered proteins that don't occur in nature, polymer chains that appear designed for biological integration, and several molecular structures I couldn't identify using standard analysis protocols. This isn't typical industrial contamination. This represents sophisticated biotechnology that was deliberately released into the environment." "How widespread is the contamination?" Elena pulled up a topographical map showing her sample locations marked with colored dots. "The contamination follows groundwater flow patterns, spreading northeast and southeast from the facility along natural drainage systems. Based on contamination gradients, I estimate the affected area covers approximately 15 square miles." Mark felt something cold settle in his stomach. 15 square miles included not just the facility property, but several farms, residential areas, and potentially water sources that served the community. "Elena, this contamination could be affecting hundreds of people. That's what concerns me most. These synthetic biological compounds are designed for persistence. They're not breaking down naturally. If anything, some of them appear to be concentrating in certain soil types and accumulating in vegetation." Elena showed Mark additional data, revealing that the contamination was not static but actively spreading through natural, environmental processes. Plants growing in contaminated soil were concentrating the synthetic compounds, creating higher exposure risks for animals that grazed in affected areas. "The cats you've been treating, they're probably getting concentrated doses by hunting small mammals that have been feeding on contaminated vegetation," Elena explained. "It's a bioaccumulation pattern that could eventually affect larger animals and potentially humans." "How long before human health effects become apparent?" "That depends on exposure levels and individual susceptibility. But based on what I'm seeing..." Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. "Mark, if people are drinking water from contaminated sources, eating food grown in contaminated soil, the health effects could already be occurring." Mark thought about Cedar Ridge's higher than normal cancer rates, the unexplained respiratory problems some residents experienced, the various health issues that everyone attributed to rural life and aging. "Elena, what if people have been exposed for years without knowing it? Then we could be looking at a public health catastrophe that's been hidden for decades." Their conversation was interrupted by Elena's phone ringing. She glanced at the caller ID and frowned. "It's my department head at the university. He never calls me directly." Elena answered the phone, and Mark could hear the tension in her voice. As she spoke, "Yes, Dr. Morrison, I understand. No, I'm not currently on campus. I'll be back tomorrow afternoon." When she hung up, her expression was troubled. That was strange. My department head wanted to know about my current research projects and whether I was conducting any environmental assessments outside normal university protocols. "Did you tell him about our project?" "No, but the fact that he's asking suggests someone has inquired about my activities." "Mark, I think our investigation has attracted official attention." They spent another hour reviewing Elena's data, with Mark copying key findings into his veterinary journal, while Elena transferred digital files to an encrypted drive. The evidence was overwhelming. The old research facility had left behind contamination that was actively spreading through the environment and potentially affecting both animal and human health. As they prepared to leave, Elena handed Mark a sealed envelope complete copies of all my analysis results. If something happens to my laboratory data, you'll still have documentation of what we found. What do you mean, if something happens? Environmental data that contradicts official government positions has a way of disappearing, especially when it involves classified facilities. I want to make sure this information survives, regardless of what pressure I might face to suppress it. Mark drove back to Cedar Ridge with Elena's words echoing in his mind. The contamination was real, it was widespread, and it represented a threat not just to individual animals, but to the entire community. Yet federal agencies seemed more concerned with maintaining secrecy than addressing the health risks. At his clinic, Mark found Tom waiting in the parking lot, clearly agitated about something. Tom's expression was grim as they walked inside together. "Mark, we have a problem," Tom said once they were safely in Mark's office with the door closed. "I've been contacted again about my consulting contract. They want me to prepare a risk assessment report about information security threats related to the Cedar Ridge situation." "What kind of threats?" "Specifically, they want me to assess the risk posed by a local veterinarian who's been conducting unauthorized investigation into environmental issues near the former research facility." Mark felt his blood chill. "They want you to investigate me. They want me to prepare a report recommending appropriate measures to contain information leaks and prevent unauthorized disclosure of classified environmental data." "And what kind of measures are they considering?" Tom was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Relocation of affected individuals, emergency classification of the contaminated area, and implementation of information control protocols that would prevent further investigation or disclosure." "They're planning to evacuate people from their homes?" "They're planning to do whatever is necessary to maintain operational security around Project Nightshade. If that means relocating residents and classifying the area as permanently restricted, that's what they'll do." Mark thought about Sarah, about Betty, about all the families who'd built their lives in Cedar Ridge, without knowing they were living in the shadow of contamination that could affect their health for generations. "Tom, how long do we have before they implement these measures?" "My report is due in 72 hours. Depending on what I recommend, they could begin emergency protocols within a week." "What are you going to recommend?" Tom looked directly at his brother. "That depends on whether you're willing to take a significant risk to protect this community." "What kind of risk?" "The kind that involves exposing Project Nightshade publicly before they can implement their damage control measures. If we can get the contamination data into the public domain, it becomes much harder for them to simply evacuate people and classify the area as restricted." Mark thought about Elena's environmental data, about the synthetic biological compounds spreading through groundwater systems, about animals and potentially people being exposed to contamination that shouldn't exist. What would we need to do? We'd need to coordinate simultaneous disclosure to multiple media outlets, scientific journals, and government oversight bodies. Once the information is public, they can't suppress it by intimidating individual researchers or relocating affected communities. And if we do this, we'll be taking on federal agencies, defense contractors, and a cover-up that's been maintained for over 30 years. There will be serious personal consequences for both of us. And if we don't do this, Tom's answer was stark. Then, this community will be quietly sacrificed to protect national security interests, and the contamination will remain hidden until it spreads far enough to affect areas that can't be evacuated and classified. Mark opened his veterinary journal and looked at the careful documentation he'd maintained over the past weeks, evidence of contamination that threatened not just individual animals, but an entire community's health and future. The choice was becoming clear, remain silent, and allow authorities to control the situation according to their priorities, or risk everything to ensure the truth reached people who deserve to know it. "Tom, If we're going to do this, we need to move quickly. Elena's environmental data provides scientific proof of the contamination. But we'll need additional evidence to make the case compelling enough that it can't be dismissed or suppressed. What kind of additional evidence? Documentation of the original Project Nightshade operations, evidence of the ongoing cover-up, and proof that federal agencies are more concerned with secrecy than public safety. Tom nodded slowly. I can provide documentation of the original operations, and my consulting contract gives me access to current information about their damage control plans. But Mark, once we start down this path, there's no going back. We'll be challenging people who have the power to destroy our lives and the lives of everyone we care about. Mark thought about the 4 cats in his clinic, about Jake Morrison and Charlie Watson trusting him to help their animals, about a community that had no idea they were living with contamination that could affect them for generations. The choice was really no choice at all. Then, we better make sure we do this right the first time, Mark said. The next morning brought a revelation that changed everything Mark thought he understood about the situation. Tom arrived at the clinic before dawn, carrying a thick manila folder and wearing the grim expression of someone who'd spent the night confronting uncomfortable truths. Mark, I need to show you something, Tom said, spreading documents across Mark's office desk. Last night I accessed the current Project Nightshade files through my consulting contract. What I found, it's worse than we imagined. The documents Tom revealed were marked with various levels of security classification, but their contents were shockingly clear. Project Nightshade had never actually ended in 1988. The facility shutdown had been a cover story to move the most sensitive operations underground while maintaining a skeleton monitoring presence on the surface. Look at this, Tom said, pointing to a document dated just 3 months earlier. Current operational status report for Cedar Ridge Underground Research Complex. Mark, the facility is still active. There are scientists and technicians working in underground laboratories right now. Mark studied the operational reports with growing horror. The underground complex employed 37 people conducting what the documents described as long-term environmental integration studies of synthetic biological agents. The contamination affecting local wildlife wasn't an accident or the result of degraded containment. It was part of an ongoing experiment. They're using the local environment as a test site, Mark said, the implications becoming clear. The contamination isn't spreading accidentally. They're deliberately monitoring how their synthetic biological agents interact with natural ecosystems. Tom nodded grimly. And the local population isn't just at risk from contamination. They're unwitting test subjects in a long-term study of environmental exposure to engineered biological materials. The documents revealed a systematic program of covert monitoring that had been ongoing for over 30 years. Water sources were regularly tested. Soil samples were collected from private properties without owners' knowledge, and health data from local medical facilities was analyzed for patterns that might indicate exposure effects. Tom, look at this. Mark pointed to a document titled Population Health Monitoring Protocol. They've been tracking cancer rates, respiratory problems, and neurological disorders in Cedar Ridge residents for decades. They know exactly what the contamination is doing to people. The health monitoring data was chilling. Cedar Ridge residents showed significantly higher rates of certain cancers, autoimmune disorders, and neurological problems compared to similar rural communities. The document clinically noted these statistical variations as useful data points for understanding long-term exposure effects. But the most shocking revelation was contained in a recent emergency protocol document. If the covert monitoring operations were ever discovered, if public attention focused on the Cedar Ridge facility, immediate steps would be taken to protect operational security. Emergency Response Protocol 7. Tom read aloud. In the event of unauthorized disclosure or investigation of Cedar Ridge operations. Implement immediate relocation of affected population under Emergency Health Authority. Classify contaminated area as biohazard zone requiring permanent exclusion. Relocate operations to alternate site. Mark felt his understanding of the situation shift completely. Tom, they're not planning to evacuate people to protect them from contamination. They're planning to evacuate people to protect their operations from discovery. And once the area is classified as a permanent biohazard zone, they can continue their research without worrying about civilian exposure or oversight. The documents revealed that Emergency Response Protocol 7 had been refined and updated regularly, with specific plans for media management, population relocation logistics, and legal frameworks for property seizure under national security authorities. Cedar Ridge hadn't just been chosen as a research site. It had been chosen as an expendable research site. Mark, there's more, Tom said, pulling out a document with a recent date stamp. This is why they wanted me to prepare a risk assessment report. Your investigation has triggered Protocol 7 implementation planning. They're not waiting to see how much you discover. They're preparing to evacuate the entire community within the next 2 weeks. The evacuation plan was detailed and comprehensive. Residents would be told that routine environmental monitoring had detected contamination, requiring immediate relocation for health protection. Property would be purchased at below-market rates under emergency authority, and residents would be relocated to other communities with financial assistance packages that included non-disclosure agreements. They've done this before, Mark realized, reading through references to similar operations. This isn't the only community they've sacrificed to protect classified research. Tom pointed to a section of the document that listed precedent operations in 3 other states, all involving communities that have been quietly evacuated and relocated due to environmental contamination discovered during routine monitoring. In each case, the affected areas had been classified as restricted zones, and former residents had been required to sign agreements preventing them from discussing their relocation experiences. Mark, we're not just fighting to protect Cedar Ridge, we're fighting to prevent this from becoming a standard operating procedure for dealing with inconvenient exposure to classified research. The documents also revealed something that made Mark's blood run cold. His investigation hadn't gone unnoticed. It had been monitored from the beginning. Phone conversations with the veterinary laboratory had been recorded. His visit to the library had been documented, and even his meeting with Elena had been observed by surveillance teams. They know about Elena's environmental testing, Tom said, showing Mark a surveillance report. They know about her contamination findings, and they know she's prepared independent documentation of the contamination spread. What are they planning to do about Elena? Tom's expression was grim. Her university laboratory suffered an equipment failure last night, a power surge that destroyed her computers and contaminated her sample storage systems. The official report will describe it as an unfortunate accident that destroyed months of research data. Mark felt anger building in his chest. They destroyed Elena's evidence. They tried to destroy Elena's evidence. But Elena is smarter than they gave her credit for. She anticipated this possibility and moved her most important data to secure off-site storage before the accident occurred. The revelation that Elena had preserved her data provided a glimmer of hope. But the scope of the conspiracy they were facing was staggering. Project Nightshade involved multiple federal agencies, defense contractors, and academic institutions. The resources available to maintain secrecy and eliminate threats were virtually unlimited. Tom, how do we fight something this large and well-organized? We use their size against them, Tom replied. Large conspiracies are vulnerable because they require coordination between multiple parties with different interests. If we can create enough simultaneous pressure on enough different fronts, Their ability to control information breaks down. Tom outlined a strategy that would involve coordinated disclosure to multiple targets: investigative journalists, environmental organizations, congressional oversight committees, and international scientific journals. The goal wasn't to convince any single entity, but to create enough simultaneous attention that suppression became impossible. But we have to move fast, Tom warned. Once Protocol 7 implementation begins, they'll have legal authority to restrict access to the area and classify all information as national security matters. We probably have 48 hours before our window closes. Mark looked at the evidence spread across his desk: documentation of a 30-year conspiracy that had used his community as an unwitting test site, contaminated the environment with synthetic biological agents, and was now preparing to evacuate the entire population to protect operational security. Tom, there's something else we need to consider. If we expose this, if we succeed in preventing the evacuation, what happens to people who are still living with contamination? What happens to the health effects that have already occurred? That's exactly why we have to expose it, Tom replied. As long as this remains secret, as long as people don't know they've been exposed, they can't get proper medical monitoring or treatment. And the contamination will continue spreading until it affects areas that can't be quietly evacuated. Mark thought about the 4 cats in his clinic, about Elena's environmental data showing contamination across 15 square miles, about health monitoring documents revealing decades of elevated disease rates among people he'd known his entire adult life. Tom, if we do this, if we succeed in exposing Project Nightshade, are we prepared for what comes next? Congressional investigations, media attention, legal battles that could last for years. Mark, if we don't do this, Cedar Ridge disappears from the map within 2 weeks, and somewhere else, another community becomes the next test site for synthetic biological agents. Sometimes the choice isn't between good and bad outcomes. It's between fighting and surrendering. Mark opened his veterinary journal and looked at the careful documentation he'd maintained throughout his investigation. What had started as notes about unusual animal injuries had become evidence of a conspiracy that challenged everything he thought he knew about government accountability and community safety. All right, Mark said, his decision crystallizing. What do we need to do? Tom smiled for the first time in days. We need to turn a veterinarian's careful case documentation into the foundation for the biggest environmental and public health scandal in decades. And we need to do it before the people responsible realize we know about their evacuation plans. The next 48 hours would determine whether Cedar Ridge survived as a community or became another classified footnote in the history of Project Nightshade. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Mark felt like they had a real chance to win. The next 36 hours transformed Mark's veterinary clinic into the nerve center of a complex information warfare operation. Tom brought in secure communication equipment, while Mark converted his office into a document preparation center, where decades of carefully maintained veterinary records would become the foundation for exposing one of the most extensive government cover-ups in recent history. Elena arrived at dawn on Tuesday, having driven through the night after her laboratory was accidentally destroyed. She carried encrypted drives containing complete backups of her environmental analysis, along with additional soil samples she'd collected from areas the surveillance teams hadn't monitored. They underestimated me, Elena said as she set up her portable computer equipment. I've been dealing with corporate environmental cover-ups for 15 years. I know how to protect data from people who want it to disappear. Mark watched Elena work with admiration and growing anxiety. Her environmental data provided scientific proof of the contamination, but the risks they were all taking were escalating rapidly. Tom's insider access to Project Nightshade documents made him guilty of federal security violations. Elena's continued research, despite official pressure, put her career and personal safety at risk, and Mark's coordination of the entire effort made him the primary target for whatever retribution might follow. "Are we sure about this?" Mark asked as Tom reviewed contact lists for investigative journalists and congressional oversight staff. "Once we start making these calls, we can't take any of it back." Tom looked up from his secure phone. "Mark, I spent the last 4 hours reviewing the evacuation timeline. They're already positioning personnel and equipment for Emergency Response Protocol 7. Trucks have been staged at facilities within 50 miles of Cedar Ridge. Temporary housing has been arranged for relocated residents, and legal frameworks are being activated for property seizure under Emergency Health Authority. How long do we have?" Based on the implementation schedule, they'll announce the contamination discovery and begin evacuations within 60 hours. After that, the area will be classified as restricted, media access will be controlled, and any evidence of the real contamination timeline will be sealed as national security information. Elena added her own timeline pressures. "My university department head called again this morning. I'm being summoned to a meeting tomorrow with federal agents who want to discuss my unauthorized environmental research. Once I'm in that meeting, they'll either co-opt me into their narrative or find ways to discredit my findings." The scope of coordination required was staggering. They needed to contact investigative journalists simultaneously, ensuring that multiple news organizations would have the story before any single outlet could be pressured to suppress it. Congressional oversight committees needed to be informed with enough detail to trigger immediate investigation. International scientific journals needed to receive environmental data that couldn't be classified as domestic security information. Sarah arrived at the clinic during the afternoon, ostensibly to bring Mark lunch, but actually to help coordinate communications with local residents who needed to understand what was happening before evacuation. Announcements created panic and confusion. "I've been thinking about this situation all night," Sarah said as she reviewed Mark's documentation. "If people are going to be forced to leave their homes, they deserve to know why. Not the official story about routine contamination discovery, but the real story about being unwitting test subjects for 30 years. Sarah, involving local residents increases the risks for everyone," Mark warned. "Once people start asking questions publicly, once they start demanding answers, then the government will have to provide answers instead of just implementing damage control." Sarah finished. "Mark, these are my students' families, my neighbors, people I've known for decades. They have a right to know what's been done to them." Tom agreed with Sarah's assessment. Local resident awareness actually works in our favor. If people understand they're being relocated to protect a cover-up rather than to protect their health, they're less likely to cooperate with evacuation procedures. They spent the afternoon developing a comprehensive disclosure strategy that would maximize impact while minimizing opportunities for suppression. Mark's veterinary journal would provide the timeline and medical evidence. Elena's environmental data would provide scientific proof of contamination. Tom's insider documents would reveal the scope of the conspiracy, and local resident awareness would create political pressure for transparent investigation rather than classified damage control. Betty proved invaluable in coordinating community outreach. Her 30 years as the clinic receptionist had made her a trusted source of information for families throughout the area, and her network of relationships provided access to community leaders who could help organize resistance to forced evacuation. "Doc, I've been thinking about my late husband's experience at that facility," Betty said as she helped prepare information packets for distribution. "Joe used to say the security was so tight because they were afraid of their own work. Maybe it's time people learned what they were so afraid of." As evening approached, Mark found himself confronting the magnitude of what they were attempting. They were challenging federal agencies with virtually unlimited resources, defense contractors with billions of dollars in classified contracts, and a cover-up that had been maintained successfully for over 30 years. The personal risks were enormous potential prosecution for security violations, professional destruction, and possible physical danger from people who had already demonstrated willingness to sacrifice entire communities to protect operational secrecy. But the alternative was equally stark. Allow Cedar Ridge to be evacuated and classified as a restricted zone. Permit the contamination to continue spreading until it affected areas too large to be quietly relocated, and enable similar operations to continue using other communities as unwitting test sites for biological weapons development. Tom interrupted Mark's brooding with news that accelerated their timeline dramatically. Mark, I just received an emergency briefing schedule. They want my risk assessment report by tomorrow morning, and they're convening an emergency response team tomorrow afternoon. If we're going to act, it has to be tonight. Elena confirmed the urgency. My meeting with federal agents has been moved up to tomorrow morning as well. They're clearly accelerating their timeline, probably because they're worried about information leaks. Mark made the decision that would determine everything that followed. Tonight, we make the calls. Tom, contact your journalists and congressional sources. Elena, send your environmental data to every scientific journal and environmental organization on your list. Sarah and Betty, begin notifying local residents about what's really happening. I'll coordinate with everyone and make sure all the information is released simultaneously. The clinic became a communication center as they divided up contact lists and began making the calls that would expose Project Nightshade to public scrutiny. Mark felt the weight of responsibility as he dialed the first number, investigative journalist who specialized in government accountability stories. This is going to sound incredible, Mark began when the journalist answered. But I have documentation of a 30-year government conspiracy involving biological weapons testing, environmental contamination, and the planned evacuation of an entire community to cover up the evidence. The conversation that followed set the pattern for dozens of similar calls throughout the night. Initial skepticism gave way to serious interest as Mark provided specific details and offered to transmit supporting documentation immediately. Each journalist, congressional staff member, and environmental organization received the same comprehensive package: Mark's veterinary documentation, Elena's environmental analysis, Tom's insider reports, and a timeline showing the planned evacuation designed to protect operational secrecy rather than public health. By midnight, they had contacted 43 different organizations and individuals, creating a network of simultaneous disclosure that would be impossible to suppress through traditional damage control methods. More importantly, they had established multiple independent timelines for publication and investigation that would prevent any single entity from being pressured into silence. Sarah coordinated community notification through her network of teaching colleagues, parent-teacher organizations, and neighborhood groups. By dawn, hundreds of Cedar Ridge residents would understand that their planned evacuation was designed to protect a cover-up rather than their health, and they would be prepared to resist relocation efforts with organized community opposition. As the sun rose on what might be the last day of Cedar Ridge as Mark knew it, he felt a mixture of exhaustion, anxiety, and cautious optimism. They had done everything possible to ensure that the truth about Project Nightshade would reach the public before authorities could implement their damage control measures, but they had also set in motion forces that could not be controlled or predicted. By dawn, federal agencies would realize that their carefully maintained secrecy had been comprehensively breached. Emergency Response Protocol 7 would still be implemented, but now it would occur under intense public scrutiny rather than bureaucratic cover. Mark opened his veterinary journal one final time and wrote an entry that summarized everything that had led to this moment. What had started as routine care for injured animals had become evidence of a conspiracy that challenged fundamental assumptions about government accountability and community safety. In a few hours, the world would learn what 4 barn cats with impossible injuries had revealed about the hidden dangers lurking in a quiet farming community. The next few hours would determine whether their efforts succeeded in protecting Cedar Ridge or whether they had simply ensured that the community's destruction would occur in the harsh, the glare of public attention rather than bureaucratic darkness. Either way, the secrets of Project Nightshade would finally be exposed to the light. Dawn brought the sound of helicopters circling Cedar Ridge and a convoy of government vehicles establishing checkpoints on the roads leading into town. Mark watched from his clinic window as federal agents in hazmat suits began setting up what appeared to be a mobile command center in the high school parking lot. At precisely 7 o'clock, every phone in Cedar Ridge began ringing with an automated message from the Emergency Management Agency. Attention residents. Environmental contamination has been detected in your area. For your safety, temporary evacuation procedures will begin immediately. Please remain in your homes until evacuation personnel arrive. But instead of compliance, the message triggered organized resistance. Sarah's overnight notification campaign had prepared the community for exactly this moment. Residents who understood they were being relocated to protect a cover-up rather than their health began gathering at predetermined locations, demanding answers and refusing to leave their homes. Mark's clinic became an unofficial command center for community resistance. By 8 o'clock, more than 100 residents had gathered in the parking lot, including Jake Morrison and Charlie Watson, the farmers whose cats had started Mark's investigation. Betty coordinated communications, while Elena documented the federal response with video equipment that would provide real-time evidence of evacuation procedures. Tom arrived with news that their overnight disclosure campaign had succeeded beyond their most optimistic expectations. Mark, it's working. The Washington Post is publishing their story in 30 minutes. CNN is preparing a live report for their morning show. 3 congressional committees have announced immediate investigations. But the federal response was also more aggressive than anticipated. Agent Reynolds appeared at the clinic, accompanied by a team of armed federal marshals, clearly prepared to implement evacuation procedures, regardless of community resistance. Dr. Ellison, you and your associates are interfering with emergency health protection procedures, Reynolds announced. I'm ordering you to disperse this gathering immediately and comply with evacuation instructions. Mark stepped forward, surrounded by his neighbors and friends, holding a thick folder containing copies of all the evidence they'd compiled. Agent Reynolds, these people have a right to know why they're being forced from their homes. They have a right to know they've been unwitting test subjects for biological weapons research. Dr. Ellison, you're discussing classified information in a public forum. I'm authorizing your immediate detention for national security violations. But before the federal marshals could move, Betty stepped forward with a portable radio tuned to a national news station. The morning anchor's voice carried clearly across the parking lot. Breaking news this morning: government documents obtained by this network reveal a 30-year conspiracy involving biological weapons testing in the rural community of Cedar Ridge. The crowd erupted in angry voices as residents heard their situation described on national radio. Agent Reynolds spoke rapidly into his communication device, clearly receiving instructions from superiors who were watching their carefully planned evacuation become a public relations disaster. Broadcast lived to the nation. Elena raised her video camera and addressed the crowd in a voice loud enough to be heard by everyone present, including the federal agents. Citizens of Cedar Ridge, you are being evacuated not to protect your health, but to protect a government cover-up. The contamination you've been exposed to was deliberately created through biological weapons research conducted at the facility. North of town, more helicopters appeared overhead, and additional federal vehicles began arriving, but their presence only reinforced the community's determination to resist. Sarah organized the crowd into smaller groups, each with specific roles. Some would document federal actions, others would provide testimony to arriving media representatives, and still others would maintain contact with family members who might be pressured to comply with evacuation orders. Mark found himself at the center of a situation he'd never imagined when he first examined Patches, the barn cat whose mysterious wounds had started this entire investigation. But as he looked at the faces of people he'd known for decades, patients' families, Sarah's students' parents, neighbors who'd become friends, he felt a clarity about his choices that surprised him. Agent Reynolds made one final attempt to control the situation. "Dr. Ellison, I'm offering you a last opportunity to cooperate with federal authorities. Cease your interference with emergency procedures, turn over all classified materials, and we can discuss resolution of this situation through appropriate channels." Mark looked at the agent, then at the crowd of people who were refusing to be quietly relocated to protect a conspiracy they'd never consented to participate in. "Agent Reynolds, the only appropriate channel for resolving this situation is full public disclosure and transparent investigation. These people deserve to know what's been done to them." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the arrival of vehicles that changed everything. A convoy of news vans appeared on Main Street, followed by cars carrying congressional staff members who'd driven through the night to investigate the claims Tom had made in his overnight phone calls. Agent Reynolds received another communication that clearly contained orders he didn't want to follow. His expression grew increasingly grim as he listened. Then he turned to Mark with obvious reluctance. "Dr. Ellison, I'm instructed to inform you that Emergency Response Protocol 7 has been suspended pending congressional oversight review. However, the contaminated area remains under federal jurisdiction, and access restrictions remain in effect." The crowd cheered, but Mark understood they'd won only the first battle in what would be a much longer war. The immediate threat of forced evacuation had been neutralized, but the underlying contamination remained, along with 30 years of health effects that were only beginning to be understood. Alina stepped forward with her environmental data. "Agent Reynolds, this community needs immediate medical screening for exposure effects, comprehensive environmental remediation, and full disclosure of what synthetic biological agents they've been exposed to for 3 decades. Those decisions will be made through appropriate federal review processes." Reynolds replied, but his authority had been undermined by the national attention their disclosure campaign had generated. The arrival of national media transformed the parking lot confrontation into a live broadcast that reached millions of viewers across the country. CNN correspondent Jessica Chun positioned herself between Mark and Agent Reynolds, her camera crew capturing every word as the story unfolded in real time. This is Jessica Chun reporting live from Cedar Ridge, where a community is resisting federal evacuation orders after discovering they've been unwitting subjects in a 30-year biological weapons experiment, she announced, her voice carrying the gravity of a story that was reshaping understanding of government. Accountability. Elena seized the moment to present her environmental data to national television. Holding up color-coded contamination maps, she addressed the camera directly. These maps show synthetic biological contamination spread across 15 square miles of what residents believed was pristine farmland. The contamination contains engineered proteins and synthetic compounds that don't occur in nature, evidence of ongoing biological weapons research that has never been disclosed to the affected population. Agent Reynolds attempted to interrupt, but his words were drowned out by the crowd's demands for answers. Jake Morrison stepped forward, his weathered face reflecting the anger of someone who discovered his land and livestock had been contaminated for decades without his knowledge. My family has farmed this land for 3 generations, Jake told the camera. We've raised our children here, grown food here, never knowing we were living on top of some kind of government experiment. Now they want us to pack up and leave like none of this ever happened. The congressional staff members, who'd arrived overnight, began conducting impromptu interviews with residents, documenting health complaints and environmental concerns that painted a disturbing picture of a community that had suffered in silence while federal agencies maintained their cover. Up. Tom emerged from the clinic, carrying a thick folder of classified documents. His decision to fully expose Project Nightshade, now irreversible? He approached the CNN crew with the systematic approach of someone who'd spent his career in security operations. I'm Thomas Ellison, former security chief for Project Nightshade, he announced, causing a visible stir among the federal agents. I have documentation proving that this facility has been continuously operational since 1988, conducting biological weapons research under the cover of agricultural studies. Agent Reynolds moved to intervene, but Tom continued speaking to the camera. The evacuation order you're witnessing isn't designed to protect public health. It's designed to protect operational security for classified research that has contaminated this community for over 30 years. The impact of Tom's testimony was immediate and devastating. His insider knowledge, combined with the classified documents he was willing to share publicly, provided irrefutable proof of the conspiracy Mark had uncovered. Federal authorities found themselves in the impossible position of either confirming Tom's claims or allowing his allegations to stand unchallenged. Sarah organized a group of parents whose children attended Cedar Ridge Elementary, their testimony adding a human dimension to the environmental data Elena had presented. Mother after mother spoke to the cameras about unexplained health problems, learning difficulties, and respiratory issues their children had experienced, symptoms that suddenly made sense in the context of long-term exposure to synthetic biological agents. My daughter has had breathing problems since she was 3 years old, testified Maria Santos, a young mother whose family lived near the facility boundary. The doctors couldn't explain it, said it was just allergies or childhood asthma. Now, I'm learning she may have been breathing contaminated air her entire life. The federal agents' communication equipment buzzed constantly as superiors attempted to develop response strategies for a situation that had spiraled far beyond their control protocols. Agent Reynolds received instructions that were clearly unwelcome, his expression growing more grim with each conversation. Finally, a black SUV arrived carrying officials with enough authority to make real decisions. Director Patricia Hamilton of the Environmental Protection Agency emerged, accompanied by congressional liaison officers who'd been dispatched to manage the political fallout from the morning's revelations. Director Hamilton approached the crowd with the careful demeanor of someone who understood she was addressing a national audience. Citizens of Cedar Ridge, I want to assure you that your concerns are being taken seriously by the highest levels of government. Effective immediately, we are suspending all evacuation procedures and initiating a comprehensive investigation into the allegations that have been raised. The crowd's response was skeptical but cautiously hopeful. Mark stepped forward as the unofficial spokesperson for the community. Director Hamilton, this community needs more than investigations. We need immediate medical screening for everyone who's been exposed, environmental remediation to address the contamination, and full disclosure of what biological agents we've been living with for 30 years. Dr. Ellison, I understand your concerns, and I want to assure you that appropriate medical and environmental assessments will be conducted by independent experts who are not connected to the previous research operations. Elena raised her contamination maps again. Director Hamilton, these maps show that contamination has spread far beyond Cedar Ridge. Water systems, agricultural areas, and residential communities across the region may have been affected. This isn't just a local problem, it's a regional. environmental catastrophe. The admission that contamination had spread beyond the immediate area sent ripples of concern through the gathered officials. Regional contamination meant regional political consequences, involving multiple congressional districts and potentially affecting thousands of additional residents. As the morning progressed, the standoff evolved into negotiation. Federal authorities, facing sustained national media attention and growing congressional pressure, agreed to immediate suspension of evacuation procedures and establishment of independent medical and environmental assessment programs. But Mark understood that their victory was incomplete. Stopping the evacuation protected the community's immediate future, but addressing 30 years of contamination and its health effects would require sustained political pressure and years of remediation efforts. Standing in the parking lot where this confrontation had begun, surrounded by neighbors who'd refused to be quietly relocated, Mark felt a complex mixture of relief, exhaustion, and determination. They'd prevented the immediate destruction of their community, but they'd also opened questions that would reshape their lives for years to come. 6 months after the confrontation that saved Cedar Ridge from forced evacuation, Mark stood in his clinic's front yard watching construction crews break ground for the community memorial garden. The garden would honor not just the animals whose mysterious illnesses had exposed Project Nightshade, but all the residents who had unknowingly served as test subjects for a biological weapons program that should never have existed. The intervening months had brought revelations that exceeded even Mark's worst fears about the scope of the conspiracy. Congressional investigations revealed that Project Nightshade had operated continuously for 35 years, using Cedar Ridge and 4 other rural communities as long-term study sites for environmental persistence of synthetic biological agents. The health monitoring data Tom had discovered represented only a small fraction of the information federal agencies had collected about contamination effects on unsuspecting civilian populations. Ellison's environmental laboratory had been rebuilt with federal funding, and her comprehensive contamination analysis had led to the largest environmental remediation project in EPA history. The synthetic biological compounds that had poisoned Cedar Ridge's soil and water were proving extraordinarily difficult to neutralize, requiring innovative treatment technologies that were still being developed. Dr. Ellison? Mark turned to see Maria Santos approaching with her daughter Isabella, now 6 years old and showing remarkable improvement after months of specialized medical treatment. Isabella wanted to give you something. The little girl stepped forward shyly, carrying a hand-drawn picture of a barn cat with colorful flowers growing around its paws. "Thank you for helping the kitties," she said solemnly. "Mama says you helped all of us." Mark knelt to accept the drawing, remembering the 4 cats whose impossible injuries had started this entire journey. Patches, the first barn cat Jake Morrison had brought in, had made a complete recovery after months of treatment with experimental therapies developed specifically for synthetic biological exposure. The other affected cats had also recovered, their resilience providing hope for the human health effects that were proving more complex to address. The medical screening program established after the exposure revelation had identified hundreds of Cedar Ridge residents with health conditions potentially related to long-term contamination. Cancer rates, autoimmune disorders, and neurological problems that had been dismissed as rural health issues were now understood as consequences of decades-long exposure to biological agents designed for warfare applications. Betty emerged from the clinic carrying a thick folder of correspondence. At 63, she'd become something of a celebrity after her role in organizing community resistance to the evacuation. Reporters regularly contacted her for updates on Cedar Ridge's recovery, and she testified before 3 congressional committees about the human impact of classified research on civilian populations. "Doc, you've got another interview request," Betty announced. 60 Minutes wants to do a follow-up story on the community's recovery and remediation progress. Mark nodded, though he still felt uncomfortable with the media attention that had transformed his quiet veterinary practice into a symbol of government accountability and community resistance. The story of Cedar Ridge had resonated far beyond environmental and health policy, becoming a touchstone for discussions about informed consent, civilian protection, and the limits of acceptable government secrecy. Tom approached from the Memorial Garden construction site, his consulting business now focused on helping other communities identify and address potential exposure to classified research operations. His testimony had been crucial in congressional investigations, but it had also ended any possibility of returning to security work. Instead, he'd found purpose in applying his insider knowledge to protect communities rather than government secrets. The memorial design looks good, Tom said, joining Mark and Betty. I think having the animals and residents represented together sends the right message about shared vulnerability and shared recovery. Sarah arrived carrying a picnic basket, her fourth-grade class having organized a lunch for the construction workers as a community service project. Her students had become passionate advocates for environmental protection after learning how contamination had affected their own families, and several had expressed interest in careers in environmental science or public health. The kids are excited about planting the memorial garden next month, Sarah told Mark. They've been researching plants that can help clean contaminated soil. They want the garden to be both beautiful and functional. As they shared lunch in the shade of the oak tree, where Mark had first met with Agent Reynolds, the conversation turned to the ongoing challenges facing Cedar Ridge. Environmental remediation would continue for years, requiring sustained federal funding and technological innovation. Health monitoring and treatment programs were helping residents cope with exposure effects, but some health impacts might not become apparent for decades. The legal battles were equally complex. Class action lawsuits filed on behalf of affected residents sought compensation not just for health effects and property damage, but for the violation of informed consent rights that had allowed the community to be used as an unwitting test site. Defense contractors and federal agencies were fighting to limit their liability, claiming that national security considerations justified the deception. Mark opened his veterinary journal, now preserved in multiple archives as historical evidence of how the conspiracy was uncovered, and read his final entry aloud. Today marks 6 months since we learned that our community had been living with contamination from biological weapons research for over 30 years. The animals I thought I was saving by investigating their mysterious injuries ultimately saved all of us by revealing a truth that needed to be exposed. The recovery process will take years, and some effects of the contamination may never be fully reversible. But we've also discovered something important about the resilience of both individual animals and human communities when they face challenges together. Patches, the barn cat whose unusual wounds started this investigation, now spends her days in our memorial garden, where she seems to understand that she played a role in protecting her human neighbors. Sometimes the most important discoveries come from paying attention to the smallest victims of the largest conspiracies. Cedar Ridge survived because people refused to accept that their safety was less important than someone else's secrets. That lesson applies far beyond our small farming community. It applies anywhere communities must decide whether to trust authorities who prioritize secrecy over safety. As the sun set over Cedar Ridge on this anniversary of their resistance to forced evacuation, Mark felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and responsibility. They had saved their community from destruction, but they had also inherited the obligation to help other communities protect themselves from similar exploitation. The memorial garden would bloom next spring, its flowers growing in soil that was slowly being cleansed of synthetic biological contamination. The garden would serve as both remembrance and hope, remembrance of the animals and people who had suffered from decades of hidden contamination, and hoped that communities armed with truth and determination could protect themselves from those who would sacrifice innocent lives for classified convenience. Mark looked at the drawing Isabella had given him, showing a barn cat surrounded by colorful flowers, and understood that sometimes the smallest acts of care, helping an injured animal, asking difficult questions, refusing to accept easy answers, can lead to the most important discoveries about protection, justice, and the courage required to defend both.